One of the strategies that I use and encourage other gardeners to use for getting the most out of their gardens each year is succession planting. This is the process of planting a new crop of something after the first one has a little bit of growth on it so that we can harvest pretty continuously, or planting a second crop after a first one has just given its all. This might make you think that you need to be buying new transplants or starting new seedlings all over again to get these succession plantings in the ground on time. Now, oftentimes for things like leafy greens or squashes, we can just pop some seeds directly in the garden and call it good. But for larger plants or those that grow slowly from seed, like tomatoes or basil, it's better to transplant them as started seedlings. The fastest and easiest way to do this is with cloning. No, we're not talking about the sci-fi version of cloning or even Dolly the sheep type clones. Propagating your own plants from cuttings of your most productive vegetable, herb, or fruit plants can be very simple and straightforward, and it does not require any special equipment. Not only can you do this for your garden successions, but it's a good way to get new plants for expanding the garden too. Today on Just Grow Something, we'll cover the easiest vegetables, fruits, and herbs to clone for either succession plantings or just for expanding the garden, the benefits of cloning, and exactly how to clone them. You might be surprised at just how easy it is. Let's dig in. Hey, I'm Karen. I started gardening in a small corner of my suburban backyard, and now 18 years later, I've got a degree in horticulture and operate a 40-acre market farm. I believe there is power in food and that everyone should know how to grow at least a little bit of their own. On this podcast, I share evidence-based techniques to help you plant, grow, harvest, and store all your family's favorites. Consider me your friend in the garden. So, grab your garden journal and a cup of coffee and get ready to just grow something. Countdown to the 200th episode of this show has begun, and I want you to ask me anything you want to, and I will answer it on that episode. This can be gardening related, podcast related, questions about my time in the Marine Corps, or about running a market farm, whatever you want. The question of the month for the month of May is you asking me the questions. Answer directly in Spotify, jump in the Facebook group, send me an email or DM on social. You have until May 31st to send me your question or multiple questions. It's up to you. Okay, so talking about cloning, it may sound intimidating. It really, really is not. There are actually very simple, straightforward methods that we can be cloning our plants. But what are some of the reasons we might consider doing this? First of all, again, we're talking about succession plantings. So if you are trying to plant these plants one after another, it might be easier to start some of them from cuttings rather than starting them straight from seed. Or if you have a staggered planting. So for my gardeners who are in really, really hot climates where your tomatoes are going to start early on in the early part of the season, very, very early spring, but you're growing determinates because by the time you get to the middle of the summer, it's just too hot and it's killing off those tomatoes, you very well can plant a second crop of determinate tomatoes in the late summer or early fall for harvesting later on. So an easier way to do this is to take cuttings off of your first set of plants and grow those out until it's time to plant them in the garden for the fall. Another reason you might want to clone is if you want to overwinter some of your best specimens of these annual type plants, peppers and tomatoes being prime example of this. You can take cuttings from your best producers at the very, very end of the season and have little baby plants that you're basically bringing in and overwintering indoors. And these cuttings are going to be exact duplicates. So if you are battling something very specific, if you've had production problems or you've had disease issues, you can duplicate the plants that have done the best in these situations, the ones that have the best production, the best disease resistance, the best drought resistance, whatever it is that you're facing, these are going to be exact duplicates. So you get to keep the best of the best. Now, cloning vegetables from cuttings is a really great way to propagate your favorite plants without relying on seeds. you are going to get genetic consistency. Okay, so cloning ensures that the new plants are genetically identical to the parent plant. So you are preserving all of your favorite traits, the flavor, the size, the color, the disease resistance, or the drought resistance, whatever it is. You can reproduce your best performing plants and get that kind of continued quality and performance that you want in your garden. Cloning from cuttings is also often faster than growing plants from seeds, especially for plants that take a really long time to germinate from seed or ones that take a really long time to reach maturity. Because you are taking cuttings from mature plants, they're going to establish and produce a harvestable yield much more quickly than one that you are starting from seed. Which also means that this is more cost effective too. You don't have to go and purchase new seeds or new plants in order to keep these plants going. And if you are growing rare or heirloom varieties of things, cloning is also going to help preserve those genetics. Or if you have like hard to find plant varieties that aren't readily available as seeds or even as started plants, using a cloning is actually going to maintain not just the genetic purity of some rare or heirloom plants, but it's also going to ensure all of those unique characteristics are retained. I'll give you a very good example of this when it comes to sort of decorative plants. When you see plants in the garden center that have this beautiful variegation to them, oftentimes the reason that you see that variegation is because those plants have been cloned. Variegation in leaves is actually a mutation, and it is very difficult to reproduce a mutation consistently. So in most instances, those plants are not being reproduced from seed. They are being reproduced from cuttings to make sure that they retain that variegation. That is just one example. So another reason for doing cloning is it allows you to basically copy your healthiest disease-free plants. So this is going to reduce the risk of introducing pathogens into the seeds. So you can select plants that have shown resistance to certain diseases, and of course that's just going to enhance the overall health of your garden. It also helps you overcome any seed germination challenges that you've had. Some plants are just not easy to germinate, or they have low germination rates. So cloning bypasses this issue, and it ensures that you actually get a viable plant. Plus, you also don't have to worry about how long you have stored those seeds, because that, of course, is going to reduce the viability. It also minimizes hybridization risks. So if you are growing things that cross-pollinate really easily, if you're trying to maintain a specific type, you can clone, and that makes sure that the offspring remain true to the parent plant and they haven't had some sort of unwanted hybridization. All right, so some vegetables are really particularly well suited for cloning. It's because they are just have an ability to root very easily from stem cutting. My three favorites are tomatoes, sweet potatoes, and peppers. Okay, tomatoes are probably the most well-known vegetable for cloning from cuttings. It is super easy. Peppers also can be cloned. They do take a little bit longer to root. And then sweet potatoes are slightly different, and I'll explain that here in a minute. So let's start with the tomatoes. Essentially, all you want to do is choose a healthy, non-flowering side shoot. Okay, these are usually the suckers that we are told to prune off of our tomato plants during the season. So every single one of those suckers that you are pruning off of that plant can be turned into a brand new tomato plant. So all you want to do is choose one of those side shoots. About 6 to 8 inches long is a good length. Strip off any lower leaves, just leave a few of them at the top, and then place that cutting into water. I prefer to do water. You can do it directly into moist soil, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But my preference specifically for tomatoes is water, because I can see the roots developing. So I don't constantly have to worry about whether or not that stem is sitting in the soil and it's just rotting. I know that it's pulling roots. So if I stick it into a jar of water and I stick it up in my windowsill, within a few days, I will generally start to see roots. Sometimes it'll take about a week or two, but eventually that whole jar is going to end up full of roots off of that cutting. And then you just place it into the soil, and there you have a brand new plant. Now, peppers are about the same way. You want to do a 6 to 8 inch cutting off of a healthy pepper plant. Remove any lower leaves. It's okay on the peppers if it's a flowering portion, that's fine. You also want to remove any flowers, though, if that's the case, and then place the cutting in water or soil. I tend with peppers to use a little bit of powdered rooting hormone. You can find that at just about any garden center, or you can order them online. It's very inexpensive. You just kind of dip the end of the cutting into that rooting hormone, and then I like to put it into very moist soil. I like that for peppers just because they generally take longer to develop their roots. It could be 2 to 4 weeks for them to grow their roots out. And from what I've seen in putting it in water, it will tend to just rot a little bit faster if it's just in the water than if I use the rooting hormone and pour it into the soil. That's my preference. You can try it both ways and see what works for you. I have done this with peppers, really good producing peppers that I wanted to keep going, taken cuttings off of them and rooted them and just kept them in my seed starting area over the winter time. Not putting enough light on them where they really want to actively grow and try to produce. I'm only doing about 6 hours or so instead of the normal 12 to 15 that I would put on them if I really wanted them to actively grow. That means they don't get too big for me over the winter time, but by the time it comes spring, I have this beautiful specimen. Or you can actively have them grow, and then when you're ready to start creating new plants to go out into the garden for the spring, then you take all of the cuttings off of your big clone, and now you have 12 or 15 peppers that you can put outside that you have created from one productive plant. It is a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant way to get a jump on the season. Now, finally, sweet potatoes. They're easy to do. You do this a little bit differently, though, because you have to have an actual sweet potato root in order to create the slips that you're going to root, if that makes sense. So you want to have an active sweet potato. And I think that we did an episode on sweet potatoes, specifically on propagating them. I'll have to link to that in the show notes. But essentially, you're just going to take a sweet potato and put it into a little bit of soil and allow it to grow roots. Now, this might happen just by you storing them in your pantry or whatever. When those start to sprout, those little slips are what you can grow new sweet potatoes from. So you break off those slips off of the sweet potato once they get to be about 6 inches or so, remove any lower leaves that have kind of popped up, and just put those slips into water until those roots develop. And then take them outside and plant them. This is cloning. So that's how we do sweet potatoes. It is very simple and straightforward. With any of these cuttings, you are just taking the cuttings and putting them in water or in soil, letting them root, and voila, you have a brand new plant. It really is not that difficult. Roses often have a bad reputation for being fussy and hard to grow, and I will admit I was one who agreed with that reputation, but only because most big box store roses are grafted. Heirloom Roses believes roses should be grown the way nature intended, on their own roots, with as little human intervention as possible. With own root roses, you can avoid the headache of dealing with rootstock and worrying about your rose not surviving the winter, because own root roses are naturally stronger, more disease resistant, and have a longer life expectancy. Heirloom Roses wants you to invest in your garden by choosing healthy roses on their own roots. With over 900 varieties to choose from and a 1-year guarantee, Heirloom Roses has every rose you could want at heirloomroses.com. You can take 20% off all their roses with code JUSTGROW now through October 31st, 2024. Add some beauty and fragrance to your garden with natural, own root roses and save 20% with code JUSTGROW at heirloomroses.com. Now, it's not just vegetables that we can do this from. There are a ton of herbs that are super easy to clone from cuttings. Basil is probably one of the easiest, and you can do this either by taking a 4 to 6 inch cutting off of a healthy basil plant that you already have, or if you have purchased basil, either at the farmer's market or at the grocery store, you can take one of those cuttings, because essentially that's what it is. When you're harvesting the basil, you're taking a cutting, and you can put that into water. Just put the end of it into the water, and the roots should appear in about a week. Another one that is just as easy as basil is mint. It is very vigorous and very easy to clone. Same thing, a 4 to 6 inch piece, and just pop the end of it into a jar of water, and the roots are going to form in about a week, and then you can just transplant it right into the soil. Rosemary is also clonable. It just takes longer to root. The action of doing it is very straightforward. You just want about a 4 to 6 inch cutting, and you want to strip the lower leaves off of the cutting. And then I always make sure that I am dipping the end of that cutting into some rooting hormone. Rosemary, because it's a little bit more woody, is going to take a little bit longer to grow or to root. And so that's why I use the rooting hormone. We also do this one directly into the soil. We don't try to root rosemary in the water. It doesn't work very well, and it will tend to rot because it's going to take about 4 to 6, sometimes 8 weeks for rosemary to start forming its roots. Now, if you live in an area where rosemary does not overwinter. I know for some of you, rosemary is a perennial. As a matter of fact, my ex-in-laws, when I was growing up, they had a huge rosemary bush in the front entryway to their house. And we lived in Northern California at the time. And it wasn't until I was a full-blown adult gardener that I remembered in my head exactly what it was that they had growing just as an ornamental by their front door. I didn't know it was an herb. They never used it for that. It was just an ornamental bush. That doesn't happen here in West Central Missouri. We can't grow rosemary like that. And generally speaking, we're planting it as an annual. So if you live somewhere like I do, where it's hit or miss as to whether or not it's going to survive the winter, and you have this beautiful rosemary plant going, take several cuttings off of it and just put them into little containers of soil and bring them inside. And by the time they start rooting, they will grow for you just in a windowsill over the winter time. And come spring, you can bring it back outside, and there, boom. You don't have to go buy a new rosemary plant. You have 4, 5, even 6 of them that you can work with throughout the rest of the season. Oregano also does really well rooting from cuttings. So does thyme. Same thing, about, a 4 to 6 inch cutting off of them, strip off those lower leaves. Oregano and thyme can both be rooted in either water or soil. I typically tend to do soil with these just because I can kind of set them and forget them. They don't take very long to do it in the soil that way. Oregano, usually about a week or so. Thyme, maybe 2 to 3 weeks. So I just make sure to keep that soil moist and stick them in a warm spot where they get an ample amount of light, but not like direct light. You don't want to cook them in the soil while you're waiting for them to root because they're not actively growing. So just sort of ambient light and a warm spot, and just kind of ignore them. Make sure they stay moist, the soil stays moist, and they're going to root, and you don't really have to do a whole lot else. Okay, so what about cloning fruit trees and fruit bushes or canes? That is absolutely something that you can do. Now, we may not necessarily be doing this in terms of like a succession planting like we would with, tomatoes or something else or any of our herbs, but it might be something that we want to do in order to increase the size of our garden or add more fruit trees or more bushes to our selection. We can't really talk about cloning fruit plants or trees without understanding the difference between hardwood and softwood cutting. So let's tackle that before we talk about cloning our fruits. Hardwood cuttings are the mature, dormant wood from the previous season's growth. So this wood is firm. It's usually a different color from the fresh growth. It has no active leaves on it. These cuttings are taken during the dormant season, typically in the late fall, sometime through the winter, or the very, very early spring before all the new growth starts coming on. The advantage to using a hardwood cutting is these cuttings are more resilient to being handled. They are less prone to wilting compared to a softwood cutting. So if you picture in your head the cuttings that you would take off of a tomato plant, and if you let it sit out for even just 15 minutes or so without immediately sticking it into some water, it's going to start to wilt. Softwood cuttings are very similar to this. Hardwood cuttings are quite literally like a branch that's coming off of a tree. And so it's firmer and it's dried and it's dormant, so it's not going to wilt. That also means that they can be stored for a little while before planting, which makes them very convenient if you are having to do this in stages or you're doing a lot of them at one time. The disadvantage to hardwood cuttings is that they typically do take longer to root compared to softwood cuttings, and there are just some species that are less likely to root from hardwood. They really do need to be done with the softwood cuttings. Now, softwood cuttings are the softwood is the new tender growth. Okay. This is that flexible, actively growing growth on your tree or on your bush. So the softwood cuttings are taken during the growing season. So hardwood is in the off season, in the dormant season. Softwood is in the growing season, typically in the late spring up into the early summer when the wood is still nice and soft and green. The advantages to using softwood cuttings is that, well, you generally get faster rooting because those active growth hormones are in the plant tissue when you cut it. So you often are going to have a higher success rate for certain species if you use the softwood cuttings. The disadvantage is that they are more delicate and they are prone to wilting or damage during handling. So they need to be planted immediately after cutting just to prevent them from drying out and getting wilted. Now, when you're taking hardwood cuttings, you want healthy, disease-free branches. You want them about the size of a pencil thickness. Your cuttings are going to be about 6 to 12 inches long. And of course, you're going to want to remove any leaves or buds from the lower half. Oftentimes with hardwood, I will dip the cut end into a rooting hormone just to hedge my bets a little bit. And then you're going to insert that hardwood cutting into well-draining soil, making sure that there are 1 or 2 leaf nodes, well, where there used to be leaves, buried into the soil. And then you just keep the soil moist and protect those cuttings from extreme weather. When you're doing the softwood cuttings, you want to choose non-flowering shoots from these healthy plants. And the cuttings should snap when they bend. So that means they're not too soft. Like if you can bend it and it just kind of, flops over and it's totally flexible, that means it's a little too soft. If you can't bend it at all, that means it's too woody. So your cutting should be somewhere in between. If you bend it too far, eventually it would break. And your cuttings on these are going to be a little bit shorter, almost by half or more so, than your hardwood. You need about 4 to 6 inches of the softwood. And again, just like with the hardwood, you just remove the leaves from the lower half. You dip the cut end into rooting hormone if you want. I generally don't with the softwoods, but it's up to you. And then again, using a moist, well-draining soil mix. With the softwood, it's a little bit more important to keep it in an indirect light and keep it consistently moist. You may need to cover it with like plastic wrap or put it someplace where you're going to maintain the humidity. They will root faster because of this, but this is a little bit less important when you're using hardwood cuttings. So what can we propagate from what can we clone from cuttings? Figs. Figs are super easy to propagate from cuttings, but also apples and pears and pomegranates and just about any fruit tree can be propagated or cloned from cuttings. So when we're talking about fruit trees, we want to use dormant hardwood cuttings. Okay, so these are the ones that are about 8 to 12 inches long from last season's growth. So cut it, take off any leaves, use that rooting hormone to your advantage, and then pop the end of it into a well-draining soil mix, water it really well, and then just kind of keep it in a warm, humid place and let it do its thing. It's going to take a few weeks. It could take several months for these to develop roots. So remember, with the hardwood cuttings, it's going to be a little bit more slow. Just be patient. You can also do this for grapes. Grapevines root easily from hardwood cuttings. You just want to make sure you pull off any leaves or any of the tendrils before you go ahead and put that into the soil. Now with blackberries, you can either propagate them from softwood or hardwood cuttings. So either way, you want about a 6 to 8 inch cutting. So new growth for the softwood, dormant wood for the hardwood. And then it's the same procedure, putting it into a moist, well-draining soil mix. Softwood cuttings are going to root faster. These will probably only take a couple of weeks. The hardwood is going to take a little bit longer. Raspberries, gooseberries, and elderberries, these are all very similar to blackberries in how easy they are to propagate. Again, softwood or hardwood, either way, whatever is easiest for you. Blueberries, on the other hand, they can be propagated from either softwood or hardwood, although they can be slightly more challenging than other berries. And I think that this is because they like that real acidic soil. And most sort of potting mixes that you get are going to be a little bit more neutral. So if you're trying this with blueberries, I would recommend about a 4 to 6 inch cutting from either the new growth on the softwood, or if you're going to use dormant wood, make it about 6 to 8 inches long. Definitely use the rooting hormone here. That's going to help get you off to a better start. And then see if you can find an acidic soil mix, something that is used specifically for blueberries or other acid-loving plants. That's going to give you a little bit of an advantage because it's going to be in its more preferred environment, essentially. And then just keep that soil consistently moist and humid. It'll probably take a few weeks for those roots to develop. So again, have some patience and you should start to see some progress. So in general, things that we want to think about when we're cloning anything, right? We want to make sure that we are keeping the cuttings in a warm, humid environment with indirect light to encourage the rooting. If we are rooting in water, typically you want to use clean, chlorine-free water. If you have a filter that you can use, that's great. If you use your regular tap water, obviously it's slightly chlorinated to keep it clean. So that might delay rooting a little bit. So just keep that in mind. And then you're probably going to want to change that water every few days just to prevent any stagnation from setting in. If you're using a soil, if you're doing a soil propagation, then just make sure that it is a light, well-draining soil of some sort. Potting mix is fine if that's what you have. If you have like a seed starting mix on hand, that is also really good because that's going to drain a little bit better and you'll have less chance of it rotting. But I've never had a problem with just using a regular potting mix to start my cuttings from. And just be patient. Make sure that you're checking the cuttings regularly for root development and also check for any signs of decay. So any sort of rotting that you're seeing going on in the stems. And also make sure that you're not seeing any signs of disease because that's definitely not something that we want to clone. So we always want to make sure that we're picking, disease-free, very vigorous plants for cuttings. You want to duplicate the best of what you have in your garden. You don't want to take cuttings from any sickly plants or anything that is more prone to disease or actively has a disease. And again, while it is optional, rooting hormone absolutely can improve your success rates, especially when you have things that tend to be a little bit more challenging. It's perfectly fine to try it without it. I propagate most things, at least as far as the herbs are concerned, are easy to do without a rooting hormone. But I have learned over time that there are certain things that just do better with it, rosemary being one of them, or anything that is a hardwood cutting. Everything that we talked about was cloning from cuttings, but there actually is an alternative method for cloning your fruit trees, and that is by a process called air layering. Now, this can be more successful if you don't have a lot of time to monitor your cuttings because the tree or the shrub that you're cloning is actually going to be actively feeding the new clone while it roots. So you can actually sort of, set it and forget it. You set this up and you walk away and you come back later on and you check to see if you have the roots, right? So this is what you do to air layer a fruit tree. You are going to find a small branch of the tree that you're looking to use to create a new tree. You want it to be about 1/8 of an inch in diameter, about 1.5 to 2 centimeters or so. Remove a complete ring of bark from a section of that branch. And then you want to sort of lightly scrape the branch down about 1/3 of the way through the branch. This is to break through the cambium layer and disrupt the phloem. This is where the tree sap is. We want it to form new roots in this spot, but we don't want it to heal over the area that we've cut. So cutting into the branch sort of disrupts this. Now, if you have some rooting hormone, you can absolutely put this on the exposed wood at this point, and this will help speed up the process. It's not necessary, at all. If you've tried this method before and you failed, then give it a shot with the rooting hormone the next time and see if you have better success. Now, here is the sort of tricky part with this air layering. You are going to want to apply a moist potting soil mix to the exposed area and keep it in place somehow. So the easiest way to do this is to use a plastic container like an old yogurt container or a butter tub or something, but you can even use aluminum foil wrapped around the branch. We're essentially creating a wrap around the exposed area of the branch that will keep it in contact with the moist soil that we want to put on top of it. So if you picture a small yogurt container with its lid off, and you cut a slit in the top at opposite sides of the rim, down about an inch or so, and then you create a hole at the bottom of each one of those slits for a little branch to rest in. So then picture the branch slides into the slits at the top, it rests in the holes that you created, and then you fill the container with wet potting soil. So it completely encloses around that area that you have cut into on the branch. And then you just put the lid of the container on, right? So it's sort of, now you have the exposed section of the branch sitting in this soil inside this container, still on the tree, preparing to root. That's it. So you can also do this with like aluminum foil, but you place the soil in the foil and then wrap it tightly around the branch. This takes some practice, but it is doable. You can also purchase rooting balls for this purpose. They're relatively inexpensive. They're designed to just clamp onto the tree branch while holding the soil in place. They are reusable, and you can get like a 6 or 8 pack of them for like $10 or something like that. I just always prefer to use what I have on hand. So I've used yogurt containers and it worked well for me. In fact, I used it to clone a Schefflera plant, which absolutely is not a fruit tree, but it was one of my house plants that I wanted to duplicate, and that's what I used, was a yogurt container. So once the container is filled, you just close the lid, you use tape or a rubber band or something just to kind of keep everything closed and tight. The key here is to make sure that that potting soil that you're using is really, really damp when you close it up, because you don't want to have to try to open this thing back up again to keep it moist. So if you're using a yogurt container or aluminum foil, you may also want to wrap that container in plastic wrap to keep the moisture locked in until the roots have developed, so you don't have to add any additional water. This won't be necessary with those rooting balls because they sort of snap shut and they become sort of self-contained. Now, the amount of time that is needed to develop roots is going to vary according to the species of fruit tree that you are trying to clone and the time of year. It could take as little as 6 weeks if we're doing this in the early spring when everything is sort of actively growing and you've got those growth hormones going on. Or if you're doing it during the dormant months of winter, it could take several months. So if you go back out there after about 6 weeks and you look inside the container and you see that the roots haven't really gotten big enough for you to transplant, just add a little bit of water, reseal the container, and give it some more time. And that is the beauty of doing this type of a process of cloning. You don't have to really pay attention to it until you decide to pay attention to it. Those roots are just going to start doing their thing within there. Now, you don't want to let it go too long because then it gets root bound around itself, and that's not a good thing. But you don't have to actively keep checking it. You don't have to make sure that the soil is moist all the time. You don't have to change the water, all that kinds of things. You're letting the plant do it on its own on the tree. So it's a really great sort of hands-off way to clone your fruits. Now, once the root system is big and strong enough, the next step is to cut that branch away from the main tree. So just cut it right below the container and then remove that container. And now you have this ball of roots with the rest of the branch sticking up out of it. And now you just place that cutting into a pot, or you put it directly into the ground where you plan for it to grow. Ta-da! You have a new tree. Now, if the root ball seems dry, you should pre-soak this root ball to rehydrate it before you pot it up or transplant it into the ground. But if it's still nice and moist, then it can be planted right away. But that's it. You have now cloned a new tree using the air layering method. So, did it surprise you to learn how easy it could be to clone our plants? I mean, obviously, we talked about vegetables, fruits, and herbs today, but these methods can absolutely be used for our houseplants, like I mentioned, my Chaflora, or our favorite shrubs outside. Just one tiny word of caution. If you are growing a patent protected variety of something, usually these are like annual flowers or landscape plants that have come from a plant breeder that has a patent protection on their varieties, like Syngenta often does, it is actually illegal for you to propagate those plants. So plant patents are a type of intellectual property that protects newly cultivated plant varieties from being propagated from existing plants and then resold rather than having to purchase nursery stock from like an authorized breeder. Now, cloning or propagating patent protected plants for personal use within your own home is technically illegal without the permission of the patent holder. Although I don't think the plant police are going to come after you. Just don't go making clones and giving them away to your friends and your family, because then you are in violation of the law. And here in the US, those patents last for 20 years from the date of filing. So perform your cloning wisely. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Just Grow Something podcast. For more information about today's topic and to find all the ways you can get in touch with me or support the show, go to justgrowsomethingpodcast.com. Cloning or propagating patent-protected plants for personal use. Wow, say that 5 times fast. Cloning or propagating patent. Nope, not happening. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep learning and keep growing.